Welcome to today's class on English poetry. In the class yesterday, we discussed block 1. Today we are going to take up block 2. In the class yesterday, we looked at block 1. One second, my screen is stuck. Just give me a moment. In the class yesterday, under block 1, we took up 4 units. We had a study of the elements of poetry. We looked at the different forms of poetry, and I told you how this is very important. We also looked at prosody in English poetry. This is a little difficult to understand. It requires a lot of practice. Please go through your SLM and please follow unit 3 very carefully so that you can get a better understanding of prosody in English. Then we also looked at the development of English poetry from Chaucer to Milton. This is again very, very important. If you wish to continue as students of English language or literature, if you want to do your research, if you want to become teachers of English, it is important that you know the forms of poetry and also the various stages of development of English poetry. In the class today, as I told you, we are going to look at block 2. Block 2 contains 4 units. The unit titles are given there on your screen. We'll come back to these units individually in a little while from now. Please note, Unit 6, Unit 7, Unit 8 are all devoted to study of individual texts. We have to study Paradise Lost. We have to study the Prelude. We also have to study Eliot's love song of Alfred J. Prufrock. In the class yesterday, we looked at the different elements of poetry. We studied how structure, form, sound, rhythm, the theme, the meter, the tone, the use of figurative language are all elements of poetry. To understand the elements of poetry, we looked at the structure and form. We tried to understand what a basic line is in poetry is, and we said it is a verse and a group of lines that form a unit, like a paragraph in a prose passage, is called a stanza in poetry. We studied how meter is the basic structure of a line in poetry and that it is based on the use of stressed and unstressed syllables. We looked at 2 examples, iambic meter and trochaic meter. A little later we studied other examples of meters also. Then we also studied rhyme, which is the repetition of sounds in the final syllable. We took up a study of the forms of poetry. The forms that are prescribed for your study are lyric, sonnet, ode, elegy, epic and ballad. It is important that we know each of these very well so that you will be able to answer comprehensively in the examination. In the class yesterday, I told you that a lyric is a poem written to express feelings or emotions of the speaker, who could be a narrator or the poet himself. It is generally in the first person, and initially it was meant to be accompanied by the musical instrument lyre. It is very short, very simple language is used. The diction is very common, easy to understand. A single emotion is presented, and the thoughts that are depicted in the course of the lyric generally revolve around the single emotion. The musical quality continues to be retained in the lyric irrespective of the use of the lyre or not, and we generally find that the mood of the poet is reflected through the lyric. We had also looked at different examples. One example that I talked about in the class yesterday was the poem Daffodils by William Wordsworth. Then we studied a sonnet. We discussed how sonnet is a short poem in 14 lines written using iambic pentameter with end rhyme. In the course of this discussion, we also told about how it had originated in Italy and how it was brought to England later, and how Wordsworth popularized the sonnet form, and it came to be termed as the English sonnet or the Shakespearean sonnet. We also talked about the origins of the sonnet in Italy. We talked about the Petrarchan sonnet. Let me quickly take you to the example slide. We studied 2 examples of the sonnet. We looked at the Petrarchan sonnet. The example sonnet that I had used was On His Blind Eyes by Milton. And for the Shakespearean sonnet, the example sonnet on your screen is sonnet number 116. Then coming back to the forms of poetry, we looked at the ode. We studied how an ode is also a lyric poem. It is generally written in praise of a person, but it need not necessarily be a person. It could be directed at a place, an idea, or an object. The example poem that I used was Shelley's Wild Wind, Ode to the Wild Wind. And in that, the poet is addressing the wind, which is not a person. About the ode, we also talked about the Horatian odes, the Pindaric odes, and the irregular odes. We looked at the stanza pattern in these odes, and then we let me quickly take you to the example here. This is the example that I had given you in the class the other day. Then we had moved on to elegy. And elegy, I told you, is a mournful poem written to lament the death of some person. Hence, it is a meditative poem. It is a song of mourning. It is a reflective lyric. The example that I gave you was from Gray's Elegy written in a country churchyard. In the course of that discussion, I told you that there is another form of elegy called the pastoral elegy, and a very good example of a pastoral elegy is the poem Lycidas by Milton. A pastoral elegy also mourns the death of some person, but the setting is pastoral. It is as if one shepherd is mourning the death of another shepherd. We have an inquisition into the death. We have the procession, the funeral procession. We have an inquiry into the death. We have the invocation to the muses. So while the poem progresses with a sense of mourning, with a sense of loss, we find that the ending is an ending of hope. After the epic, we try to understand what an epic is. I told you the definition of the epic. It is a long narrative poem, and I had also played you one of our university YouTube channel videos. It is my own recorded video. It is on Paradise Lost as an epic, in which all the epic conventions are discussed. So please go through that audio video lesson on Paradise Lost as an epic. It will be useful here. It will be also useful when we take up a study of Paradise Lost later on in the course of Unit 6. After that, we looked at ballad. The example that I used of the ballad was The Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Coleridge. A ballad is a narrative poem. It is also set to music like the lyric. There is excessive use of refrain, that is, lines or phrases get repeated. It opens abruptly. The style is very colloquial. And we find the use of the supernatural element, and we also find the use of dialogue in a ballad. About prosodian English, I had requested you all yesterday, and as I told you a little while earlier in the class, this is a very, very practical component. It is important that we go through the SLM, look at the different lines, look at the different passages given for study. Only then will the study of versification be clear to us. Otherwise, there will be lots of doubts. About versification, we looked at certain terms: alliteration, assonance, euphony, cacophony, and onomatopoeia. Then we studied the basics of meter. We learned about what a syllable is, what is a foot, what is meter, what is scansion. The types of meters that I was talking about a little while earlier are listed here. They also tell us how many syllables does each foot contain. If it is an iambic pentameter, each foot will contain 2 syllables. The first will be unstressed and the second will be a stressed syllable. Then in the last chapter, last unit that we discussed in the class yesterday, we took up a survey of poetry from Chaucer to the time of Milton. While we were looking at this part of your syllabus, we studied how Chaucer has a very important role to play. He is considered to be the father of poetry in English, and therefore he occupies a very unique place, not just in his age, but in several ages to come. he was, as we discussed in the class yesterday, not just the greatest, but the first greatest poet writing in English. And for hundreds of years, until Shakespeare emerged on the scene, there was no one who could be compared to Chaucer. So we can say also the forerunner of other literary giants like Shakespeare and Milton. In his poetry, we find that he gives the best descriptions of men, of places, and of mannerisms. His descriptions are very beautiful, very impressive, and he makes very good use of humor. Chaucer had an eye for detail, and we find that he was a very keen observer, and this is reflected in his poetry. And for example, we can talk about the Canterbury Tales. The humor that Chaucer uses is delightful, it is very patronizing, and it is full of variety. Apart from using humor, Chaucer also made use of pathos. As a storyteller, and with specific example to the Canterbury Tales, we can say that Chaucer had very good, in fact, we can say he had great narrative power, and his contribution to the poetical technique in the Chaucerian stanza or the rhyme royal was also discussed in the class yesterday. The Chaucerian stanza, as I told you, is a 7-lined stanza with the rhyme scheme AB, AB, BC, and CC. These were the aspects that we looked at when we were discussing the age of Chaucer. We looked at the socio-economic and the political background. We looked at the various aspects that were influencing his age. We had a quick reference to his contemporaries. Then we moved on to the Elizabethan poetry. We talked about Philip Sidney. We talked about Edmund Spenser. We talked about Shakespeare in greater detail. We also said how in this age, because there was a revival of learning, there was a lot of literary activity happening around this age. About Shakespeare, we talked about many things. We talked about his narrative poems. We talked about his sonnets. We also said that Shakespeare did not introduce the sonnets on his own. He wrote a number of sonnets, 104 in all, but remember, he was not the originator of these sonnets. The sonnets came to England from Italy. We have the Petrarchan sonnets that are divided into the octave and the sestet, and then we have the Shakespearean sonnets that are divided into 3 quatrains of 4 lines each and a concluding couplet. We were also talking about how the Italian stanza form, Ottava Rima, was brought to England by Sir Thomas White, who also introduced the sonnet form in England, as also the Earl of Surrey. Then we talked about how we find a number of lyrics. He did not write lyrics separately, but in his place we find a number of lyrics. And a very good example of dramatic poetry is the different plays written by Shakespeare. We also talked about cavalier poetry. The names of the cavalier poets are given there. These poets mostly wrote about love poetry. Their themes were very trivial, very jovial. Then we looked at the contribution of John Donne to metaphysical poetry. We looked at the chief characteristics of metaphysical poetry, as you can see listed on your slide. We looked at the age of Milton. This is important because just as Chaucer stands out in his age, just as Shakespeare stands out in his age, similarly in the age of Milton, we find complete predominance of Milton. We looked at the different poetic forms that Milton used when we stopped the class yesterday. In the course of today's class, we are taking up a discussion of Paradise Lost, which I told you yesterday is an epic. So block 2 begins with a survey of English poetry from the time of Milton to Iliad. In the class yesterday, remember, we stopped with Milton. So I'm going to skip those parts of Unit 5. We will start from the period after that. After the Puritan age, there is we find a decadence in poetry, and then we find neoclassical poetry emerging on the scene. The period is given there, 1680 to 1750. The neoclassical writers were greatly influenced by the classical period, and they felt that they can write or they can produce good literature only if they imitate the classics. So imitation was a key word for the neoclassical writers. The neoclassical age is the age of Dryden, and it is the age of Pope. In fact, Samuel Johnson said that Pope did to English literature what Emperor Augustus did to Rome. He found it of stone and left it of marble. Hence, this age is also referred to as the Augustan age. You can say neoclassical poetry or you can say Augustan poetry. It would still mean the same. So in this age, there was a revival of classicism. We have the writers taking a keen interest in the classical writings and being influenced by the classical writers like Horace, Virgil, Ovid, among others. The period of neoclassicism may be divided into three. The first period is the Restoration period, where you have Milton, where you also have Dryden. This was the period when Charles II was restored to the throne of England. When we were doing drama, we talked about the Restoration period, we talked about the contribution of Congreve and Wycherley. Then the second stage is the stage of the Augustan age, which was predominated by Alexander Pope. Then the last stage where neoclassical poetry was already waning is the age of Johnson. Let us quickly look at the important characteristics of the neoclassical poetry. Because the neoclassical poets believed in classicism, they inadvertently also believed, they compulsively also believed in a strict adherence to the classical rules. They felt that if a person is writing an epic, then all epic conventions should be followed. If a tragedy is being written, then all the conventions of a tragedy as used by the classical writer should be used. But if you notice, in this period, though there was a lot of inspiration by the classical the classical age, we do not find an epic being produced. The closest this age comes to is in the production of a mock epic by Pope. It is titled The Rape of the Lock. Then there was a lot of insistence on realism. The neoclassical writers did not believe in imagination. They believed completely in reason. This age was the age of didacticism. It was felt that the writer's purpose is to educate. His work of art should be intended to teach. It should not be intended to just entertain. Because these are all well-read poets or well-read writers, we find that there is a lot of use of scholarly allusions in their works. This is also the age in which this heroic couplet became very popular. I can give you one example. Shadwell alone of all my sons is he, who stands confirmed in full stupidity. This is a very good example of a heroic couplet. A heroic couplet contains only two lines, with the lines antithetical to one another. When you look at the first line, Shadwell alone of all my sons is he, we get the impression that the person is going to praise his son Shadwell. But the second is the antithesis. It says, I'll read from the first line, Shadwell alone of all my sons is he, who stands confirmed in full stupidity. So instead of praise, it is the exact opposite that comes in the second line. This form of writing was very popular in this age. Dryden and Pope both perfected this form, but they were not the originators. It was used earlier. Satire is again a very important medium, and it had a lot to do with the political situation of the period also. So when you take up works by Dryden like Macflecknoe, or when you take up works by Alexander Pope, you'll find a lot of use of satire. Their poems are not subjective. The individual is not important. It is the society that is more important. The society takes precedence over the individual. And as I said a few seconds earlier, for them reason was more important than imagination. After this period, comes a stage of transition from the neoclassical poetry to the romantic poetry. As your mic, please mute yourself. Through the chat box, somebody requests Saghir to. Thank you, Saghir. Okay. So between the neoclassical period and the romantic period, we have a phase that is referred to as the transitional poetry, or the age of transition. This was a transition from neoclassicism to romanticism. It came out as a revolt against the neoclassical poetry. The writers who came after Samuel Johnson or around this period felt that there should be no regard for rules. So they started disregarding rules. There is a lot of subjectivity that comes in, and there is less use of objectivism. Unlike, again, the previous age, emotions become more important than reason. And like in the earlier period, lyric once again becomes more important. While the neoclassical writers were inspired by the classical age, these people were inspired by the Middle Age. And like the romantic period, which follows soon after, we find that imagination and nature become more and more important in their works. There are a few examples of transitional poets in 2 slides. James Thomson, who wrote Seasons and Castle of Indolence, among other works, who lived from 1700 to 1748, and Thomas Gray, who lived between 1716 to 1771. One of his poems was taken up as an example earlier, Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard. 2 other examples are given, The Progress of Poesy and The Bard. Some 2 other transitional poets are given here. One, Robert Burns. 2 of his poems are given as an example there, A Fond Kiss and My Love is Like a Red Rose. If you just look at the title of the poems, you will notice how this is a complete break from the neoclassical poetry. There is a romantic element that has crept in. The poet is talking about something very simple, something very common, something that is a part and parcel of everyday life, something that the neoclassical poets wouldn't ever think of. And then we have William Blake, a very, very important poet belonging to the age of transition. His 2 major works are the Songs of Innocence and the Songs of Experience. One example from the Songs of Innocence is the Lamb, and one example from the Songs of Experience is the Tiger. If you study these 2 poems separately or one by one, you will understand what is the concept of innocence and what is the concept of experience that William Blake is trying to project. Then we come to the romantic poetry. These are also the features of romantic poetry. So this will be useful for a study not just of this unit, but in unit 7, when we study Prelude by Wordsworth, these features can be used once again. So this slide that we discuss here on romantic poetry can be used to answer any question on Wordsworth's Prelude. We find now a break, in fact we can say a complete break from neoclassicism. We have most of these points that I have listed are the opposite of what we discussed in the neoclassical poetry. The neoclassical poets gave importance to reason over imagination. The romantic poets gave importance to imagination over reason. For them, society was more important than individual. Here, individual is more important than society. The romantics gave a lot of importance to spontaneous overflow of thoughts and emotions. We find that the romantics were greatly influenced by nature. Hence, there is a lot of nature imagery in their poetry. The common poetic forms that were used in this age are the lyric, the ballad, and various kinds of folk poems. The poets dealt with themes that were very common to everyday life. They used very simple diction. They felt that the poet must address the emotions and feelings of the common people. So they used language that a common person could easily understand. There's no sense of didacticism. They're not trying to teach anything. It is pure art for art's sake. When we come to poets like Coleridge, we find there is the use of supernatural element in romantic poetry. In contrast to the neoclassical poets, we find romantic poetry which is subjective and not objective, and the freedom of man was much more important. This age is also the age that was greatly influenced by the French Revolution. The French Revolution talked about liberty, equality, and fraternity, and we find that most of the aspects of the French Revolution greatly influenced the people who lived around the Romantic age. After that, we take a quick look at the Victorian poetry. Like the Elizabethan poetry, Victorian poetry refers to poetry that was written during the reign or the rule of Queen Victoria. A few important poets of this period are listed there: Alfred Lord Tennyson, Matthew Arnold, Robert Browning, the Pre-Raphaelites, and Gerald Manley Hopkins. There are others also. The dramatic monologue is a very important aspect of Victorian poetry. In a dramatic monologue, I think I have some slides on it. Let me quickly check if I have slides on. Give me a second. If it is not there, I'll tell you orally now. Okay, let me explain to you. Okay, the points are listed just below that. This was the age of the dramatic monologue. A dramatic monologue is also a kind of poem in which we have a single speaker or narrator, but this is not the poet, it is somebody else. The entire poem is delivered through the single person speech, hence the word monologue. It is dramatic in the sense that as the single person speaks, we get to feel the presence of other characters beside the speaker himself. So there is an implied audience here. There is a direct address to whoever the speaker is talking to. The beginning is abrupt, and we find that the style is colloquial. Through the monologue that is being delivered by the speaker, we come to know about the setting and the scene. Where is the setting? What is the scene like? Who are the other people? Who is the speaker talking to? The last 3 points on your screen are examples of dramatic monologues. Ulysses is a dramatic monologue by Tennyson. Porphyria's Lover and My Last Duchess are examples of dramatic monologue by Robert Browning. He in fact perfected this form. And we have Dover Beach by Matthew Arnold. These are all excellent examples of a dramatic monologue. We also have to study the Pre-Raphaelite movement. This movement or this period is called the Pre-Raphaelite because it was deeply influenced by the Italian painter Raphael of the medieval period. The kind of poetry that was written here in this poetry was extremely visual. When you read the words, you could imagine that you are seeing a painting. In fact, what some of these poets did was, along with the text, along with writing a poem, they were also artists, they were also painters, they also made a painting. For example, The Blessed Damozel is a poem written by Dante Gabriel Rossetti. It is written in the text form. There is also a painting depicting the Blessed Damozel. And this is an extremely good example of the Pre-Raphaelite poetry. In this, we find that the beloved, the woman, is dead, and she yearns to be reunited with her lover. She is in heaven, she has departed from earth, but her heart is still with her lover on earth. On the other side, we find that the lover also loves her very deeply. On earth, he can feel her presence. So in heaven, the girl or the beloved is yearning for her lover. The lover is on the earth. He also has a deep yearning for the beloved who is in heaven. So both of them apparently are true lovers who have not forgotten one another. There is exquisite imagery used here. It is, as I mentioned in one of the points here, that it is painting in word. This poetry, the kind of poetry that was written by the Pre-Raphaelites, is poetry that is written in words. Christina and Dante Gabriel were siblings. They were brother and sister. One other important poet of this age, of the Victorian age, is Gerard Manley Hopkins. Hopkins sorry, there was a little disturbance. We are talking about Gerard Manley Hopkins. Hopkins introduced the sprung rhythm in English. In the next slide, we'll read a little more about this. What kind of rhythm is it? When we were talking about meter, when we were talking about rhyme and rhythm, we talked about how one foot has one or three syllables in it, and we have a stressed or an unstressed one or two in different types of meters. In sprung rhythm, we have some stressed syllables, but there can be any number of unstressed syllables in the sprung rhythm. And unlike the foot in regular English meter, the foot in sprung rhythm has 1 to 4 syllables. So it is a little more longer or bigger. The major themes that Hopkins talked about were the themes of religion and nature. For him, religion was superior to art. A very important poem written by Hopkins is The Wreck of the Deutschland. It is an autobiographical poem. It is a poem that talks to us about the journey of Hopkins, his religious, his spiritual journey. We find in it an invocation to God. This is actually a narration of a story of a shipwreck. Through the shipwreck, Hopkins shows us a character who, even though the ship is sinking, has deep faith in God, and it is this faith in God that, according to Hopkins, who was a firm believer, that can save man or mankind. Then we come to the last aspect of this unit, where we talk about modern poetry. Give me 1 second, please. Sorry for the disturbance. We look at modern poetry and its characteristics. It is believed by many that modern poetry started in English with the introduction of imagism by which was influenced by whom? I'm sorry. Whom also advocated the use of free verse, and this use of the free verse was very welcomed by the modern writers. The term imagism is itself coined by Ezra Pound. Ezra Pound, if you remember, had a very important role to play in T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. You have studied about Eliot and about Ezra Pound and about modern poetry in semester 1. Imagism was a movement of the 20th century in which the main purpose was to provide clarity of expression through the use of images. In other words, images were used to convey meaning. In the same age, in the modern age, when we talk about the modern poetry, we have W.B. Yeats, who can be considered to serve as a link between the Victorian and the modern poets. In his poetry, we find a presentation of the spiritual barrenness that was very evident after the World War I. Yeats reiterates his faith in religion, and we find similar things happening in modern poetry. This is not unique to Yeats himself. What I am telling you about Yeats was common to the modern poetry as well. We have the use of symbolism. Symbolism is the expression of individual emotional experience through the subtle use of symbolized language. In the poetry of Yeats, the common symbols that are used are the symbols of the Gir, the sea, and the bird, among others. In the modern age, we find a shift from the rural to the urban. If you look at the Victorian period, we still find the setting very much rural, but we have already seen that it shifts gradually towards the urban. In the modern poetry, we find that the urban setting is more predominant. There is a lot of fragmentation, there is a lot of juxtaposition, and as I said, there is very good use of free words. One of the most important poets of the modern age, and a poet that is prescribed for your study, is T.S. Eliot. A poem by T.S. Eliot, The Love Song of Alfred J. Prufrock, is prescribed in Unit 8. Whatever I have told you about modern poetry, whatever I tell you now about T.S. Eliot, are points that you can use when we talk about The Love Song of Alfred J. Prufrock. In your course on the history of English literature last semester, you talked about various poets, you talked about various writers, in the course of which we have mentioned The Wasteland, which is divided into 5 sections. Then another poem by T.S. Eliot is Ash Wednesday, and one poem that is prescribed for your study is The Love Song of Alfred J. Prufrock. What we find in the poetry of T.S. Eliot, with specific reference to The Love Song of Alfred J. Prufrock, is the use of disjointed stanzas. Everything reflects modern man leading a disjointed life, modern man leading a fragmented life, the sense of disillusionment that had set in with the war, a sense of isolation that was prevalent in society, the use of symbols and images, as I told you a little while ago. There was the use of mystic elements in their poetry and a lot of use of obscure imagery. And because poets like T.S. Eliot were well read, we find that they make excessive use of allusions in their poetry. After this quick survey of English poetry up to T.S. Eliot, we take up individual poems for study. In Unit 6, Paradise Lost is prescribed for your study, not the entire book, only a part of it. The definition of epic was given to you in the class yesterday. You will also find it in the YouTube audio-video lesson on Paradise Lost as an epic. As I told you, it is written in 12 books. The theme of Paradise Lost is to justify the ways of God to men. The main subject of Paradise Lost is the fall of man. Now, among the students who are present in class now, whether you belong to Christianity or whether you belong to Islam, the background of Paradise Lost would be very clear to you. Both the Christians as well as the Muslims believe in the creation of man, they believe in the fall of man, they believe that Satan tempted man. The reference to Adam and Eve to Satan are also references that we find in both the holy books, the Bible as well as the Quran. So the subject of Paradise Lost is the fall of man, how Adam and Eve, Hawa alayhi salam and Adam alayhi salam were first in heaven in paradise, but then they were tempted by Satan. S-A-T-A-N, Satan is the English word that we use for shaitan in Urdu. So they were tempted by Satan, they disobeyed God, and they were thrown on earth. This is the story that we find in the first book of Bible, the Genesis. So the story of the Genesis is taken by Milton in his epic Paradise Lost. So the main subject of Paradise Lost is the fall of Adam and Eve from heaven as a result, as a consequence of the temptation by Satan. The poem begins in medias res, that is in the middle of action, because the epic story is already known to everybody. It is nothing new that the writer is presenting. We have the writer jumping straight into the action. When the poem opens, we find that Satan and his followers are lying in the fiery river of hell. And in the course of the other books, we learn about what happened earlier, what made them fall here, what was the battle that took place, who was defeated, who won the battle. Following epic conventions, we have Milton invoking, but unlike the other epic or the classical epic writers, Milton does not invoke the classical muses. He invokes, as a staunch Christian, he invokes the Spirit, the Holy Spirit. The purpose of writing Paradise Lost is laid down. There is extensive use of epic similes and Homeric epithets. There is the placing of the epic question. Each of these aspects that you see, each of these features that you see reflected on your screen are discussed in the audio video lesson that I told you about. When you go through that audio video lesson, all these aspects will become very clear with very good examples drawn from Paradise Lost. The inversion of word order is another very good contribution of Milton to English poetry, especially to epic poetry. I can give you some examples a little later when we take the passage from Paradise Lost that I had shared in your class earlier. About the hero of Paradise Lost, there is still a lot of controversy around it. Is Adam the hero of Paradise Lost? Is Satan the hero of Paradise Lost? Is God himself the hero of Paradise Lost? There are various questions that may come to one's mind, but we have to remember that Milton, as a staunch Christian, whose main purpose of writing Paradise Lost was to justify the ways of God to men, wouldn't even have thought of making Satan the hero of Paradise Lost. The next unit, Prelude, the next unit is on a poem by Wordsworth. It is titled Prelude. The full title of the prelude is The Prelude or Growth of a Poet's Mind. The subtitle makes it very clear what the theme of the poem is. This poem is autobiographical. It traces the journey of Wordsworth as a poet from his boyhood to the present time. Wordsworth wrote this as an epic, but the prelude was actually meant to be an introduction to a poem, Recluse, which was later published as Excursion, but even that remained incomplete. We have 12 books in the prelude. Like Milton's Paradise Lost, Wordsworth also makes use of blank verse. There is no end rhyme, but the lines are written in iambic pentameter. The prelude took a very long time to write. He started writing it in the year 1798, that is the beginning of the Romantic Age. He did not write it continuously, there were breaks in between. It was finally completed in 1805, but it was not published until after his death in 1850. The main theme of Prelude is the development of the speaker as a poet, as the subtitle clearly states, the growth of a poet's mind. This poem traces his spiritual journey. It tells us about the different influences that played on his imagination in the different stages of his life. Because Wordsworth was a romantic poet, we find that there is a deep influence of nature. A lot of nature is drawn from nature. You have breeze, wind, water, trees, etc., all drawn from nature. Nature is personified. Nature is treated as a living, as an animate being. And we have lengthy descriptions of the landscape in the prelude. The prelude is an important poem to study for the kind of imagery that Wordsworth uses. It is also important as a romantic poem because when we study the Romantic Age, when we look at the different aspects of Romanticism, you can always use prelude as an example. Talk about the Romantic Age. How did it start? How was it as a reaction to the Neoclassical Age? Talk about the different characteristics, the features, what were the main aspects. Then take prelude, find the features that you find common to both, take good examples, lines from the poem and quote them, and you will have a very good answer ready for your study. The last poem prescribed for you study in block 2 is the Love Song of Alfred J. Prufrock. As I told you, this is a poem by C.S. Eliot. So invariably we can say that this is an example of a modern poem. What are the main characteristics of modern poetry or modern literature in general? We find a focus on individual experiences and identities in modern literature, and you find the same in the Love Song of Alfred J. Prufrock. The modern poets or the modern writers did a lot of experimentation in form and style. They did not copy anything straight away from their predecessors. They were ready to invent new things. They were ready to experiment with new forms of writing. Because this was the period of the world wars, we find that there is a deep sense of absurdity and the writers fighting this sense of meaninglessness of life. I already told you about the use of symbols or symbolism in their works. So we find a symbolic representation of thoughts and ideas in their works. There is a lot of attention to the city and to the urban spaces, unlike the rural setting of the Romantic period. Because most of the time the writers are dealing with the mind of the characters, we find a good example of psychoanalysis also during this age. The right side of the slide talks about Alfred J. Prufrock. As the title conveys, this is supposed to be a love song. And whose love song? Of Prufrock's. Prufrock belongs to the upper class. He's highly educated. He's a middle-aged man. But he's trapped in his own hell and he's unable to escape from it. This is the dilemma of the modern man. The modern man is educated. The modern man lives a very upper-class urban lifestyle. But then he has lost his freedom and he does not know where to go. Prufrock is apparently in love with somebody. This is also written in the form of a dramatic monologue. The speaker is Prufrock. He's telling us something, but the audience is missing. There are no listeners. I told you in a dramatic monologue, we can feel the presence of the listeners through the words of the speaker. In this case, there is no presence of the listeners at all. And the epigraph to Alfred J. Prufrock is drawn from the Latin poet Dante, where we are talking about, there again there are no people, nobody to listen to. So Prufrock is in the same dilemma. He has something to tell, but there are no listeners. This is what most of us face even today. There is so much on our mind. We need somebody to talk to, but we often find that there is nobody who is there to listen to us. So Prufrock feels extremely alienated. He remains withdrawn. When the poem opens, we find Prufrock thinking that he will express his love to his beloved, but he's so shy, he's so afraid that he cannot even gather the courage to tell the woman that he loves her. He's making all the attempts. He tries again and again, and there are beautiful expressions in the poem. In today's class, we don't have time to look at the poems prescribed for you, but in the class on Friday, I would like to share the poems and discuss them in a little more detail. So I think with this, this is the last slide. With this, I'll stop my discussion for today. I have taken this straight from your SLM. This is a paragraph, or yes, this is a paragraph from your SLM. The words in red are important. We talk about objective correlative. When there is somebody's mic open. Who's this, Miss Kina? If you please mute yourself, I can continue to talk. Let us understand what objective correlative is. Eliot believed that a poet cannot directly communicate an emotion to his readers. He felt that the poet has to convey this emotion through some object that is suggestive of that emotion. Only then the poet could evoke the same emotion in his readers. To quote T.S. Eliot, he says, a set of objects, a situation, a chain of events shall be the formula of that particular emotion. There is a lot of use of illusions. There is use of personification. We have similes, we have alliteration, we have the use of irony, and some examples are there in red. How the poet animates fog and smoke and evening. He says that the evening is like a patient who's lying anesthetized on a hospital bed. Then the fog is like a cat rubbing itself against the windowsill. So we find a lot of use of similes that describe the evening, the street, and whatever the poet is using there are reflective of Prufrock's mind. So we find the use of metaphors, we find the use of images, we find the use of irony in Prufrock. There is not much time for us to continue the discussion today. We will discuss more of this in detail when we meet again in the class tomorrow.